It was the birthday of the Infanta. She was just 12 years of age, and the sun was shining brightly in the gardens of the palace. Although she was a real princess and the Infanta of Spain, she only had one birthday every year, so it was naturally a matter of great importance to the whole country that she should have a really fine day for the occasion. And a fine day it most certainly was. The purple butterflies fluttered about with gold dust on their wings, visiting each flower in turn. The little lizards crept out of the crevices of the wall and lay basking in the white glare. The pomegranates split and cracked with the heat, showing their bleeding red hearts. Even the lemons seemed to have caught a richer colour from the wonderful sunlight. The magnolia trees opened their great globe-like blossoms of folded ivory and filled the air with a sweet, heavy perfume. The little princess walked up and down the terrace with her companions and played at hide and seek. On ordinary days, she was only allowed to play with children of her own rank, so she'd always had to play alone. But her birthday was an exception. The king had given orders that she was to invite any of her young friends whom she liked to come and amuse themselves with her. There was a stately grace about these slim Spanish children as they glided about, but the Infanta was the most graceful of all and the most tastefully attired. Her robe was of grey satin, the skirt and wide puff sleeves heavily embroidered with silver. The stiff corset was studded with rows of fine pearls. 2 tiny slippers with big pink rosettes peeped out beneath her dress as she walked. In her hair, which like an aureole of faded gold stood out stiffly round her pale face, she had a beautiful white rose. The funniest part of the whole morning's entertainment was undoubtedly the dancing of the little dwarf. When he stumbled into the arena, waddling out on his crooked legs and waggling his huge, misshapen head from side to side, the children ran off into a loud shout of delight. The Infanta herself laughed so much. The dwarf was really quite irresistible, and so fantastic a little monster had never been seen. It was his first appearance, too. He had been discovered only the day before, running wild through the forest, and had been carried off to the palace as a surprise for the Infanta. Perhaps the most amusing thing about him was his complete unconsciousness of his own grotesque appearance. Indeed, he seemed quite happy and full of highest spirits. When the children laughed, he laughed as freely and as joyously as any of them. At the close of each dance, he made each the funniest of bows, smiling and nodding at them just as if he was really one of them, and not a little misshapen thing that nature had fashioned for others to mock at. As for the Infanta, she absolutely fascinated him. He could not keep his eyes off her and seemed to dance for her alone. After the performance, she took out the little white rose from her hair and threw it across to him into the arena with her sweetest smile. Pressing the flower to his rough, coarse lips, he put a hand upon his heart and sank on one knee before her, grinning from ear to ear and with his little bright eyes sparkling with pleasure. The Infanta kept on laughing long after the little dwarf had run out of the arena and expressed a desire that the dance should immediately be repeated. The little dwarf was so proud that he ran out into the garden, kissing the white rose in an absurd ecstasy of pleasure and making the most uncouth and clumsy gestures of delight. He danced through the garden. He liked the birds and the lizards immensely and thought that the flowers were the most marvellous thing in the whole world, except for, of course, the Infanta. How he wished that he'd gone back with her. She must certainly come to the forest and play with him. He would give her his own little bed. He would watch outside the window till dawn to see that the wild-born cattle did not harm her, nor the gaunt wolves creep too near the hut. And at dawn, he would tap at the shutters and wave to her to wake her up. They would go out and dance together all day long. He would make her a necklace of red briony berries. He would bring her acorn cups and dew-drenched gems and tiny glowworms to be stars in her pale gold hair. But where was she? The whole palace seemed asleep, and even where the window shutters had not been closed, heavy curtains had been drawn across the windows to keep out the glare. He wandered all around looking for some place through which he might gain an entrance, and at last he caught sight of a little private door that was lying open. Of all the rooms, this was the brightest and the most beautiful, but the little dwarf cared nothing for all this magnificence. He would not have given his rose for all the pearls on the canopy, nor one white petal of his rose for the throne itself. What he wanted was to see the Infanta and to ask her to come away with him when he had finished his dance. She would come with him to the fair forest, and all day long he would dance for her delight. Standing under the shadow of the doorway, at the extreme end of the room, he saw a little figure watching him. His heart trembled. A cry of joy broke from his lips, and he moved out into the sunlight. As he did so, the figure moved out also, and he saw it plainly. Was it the Infanta? No. It was a monster, the most grotesque monster he had ever beheld. Not properly shaped as all other people were, but hunchbacked and crooked-limbed with a huge lolling head and a mane of black hair. The little dwarf frowned, and the monster frowned also. He laughed, and it laughed with him, and held its hands to its sides, just as he himself was doing. He went towards it, and it came to meet him, copying each step that he made, and stopping when he stopped himself. What was it? He thought for a moment, and looked round at the rest of the room. It was strange, but everything seemed to have its double in the invisible wall of the water. Yes, picture for picture was repeated, and couch for couch. When the truth dawned upon him, he gave a wild cry of despair and fell sobbing to the ground. He himself was the monster. It was he who was misshapen and hunchbacked, foul to look at, grotesque. The children had been laughing at him, and the little princess who he thought loved him, she too had been merely mocking at his ugliness and making merry over his twisted limbs. Hot tears poured down his cheeks, and he tore the white rose to pieces. The sprawling monster did the same, scattering the faint petals in the air. It grovelled on the ground, and when he looked at it, watched him with a face drawn with pain. He crept away lest he should see it, and covered his eyes with his hands. He crawled like some wounded thing into the shadow, and lay there, moaning. And at that moment the Infanta herself came in with her companions through the open window, and when they saw the ugly little dwarf lying on the ground and beating the floor with his clenched hands in the most fantastic and exaggerated manner, they went off into shouts of happy laughter, and stood all around him and watched him. "His dancing was funny," said the Infanta, "but his acting is funnier still. Indeed, he's almost as good as the puppets, only of course not quite so natural." And she fluttered her big fan and applauded. But the little dwarf never looked up, and his sobs grew fainter and fainter, and suddenly he gave out a curious gasp and clutched at his side. He fell down again and lay quite still. "Dance!" cried all the children. "You must get up and dance, for you are as clever as the Barbary apes and much more ridiculous." But the little dwarf never moved, and the Infanta stamped her foot and called out to the priest who was walking on the terrace. "My funny little dwarf is sulky," she cried. "You must wake him up and tell him to dance for me." The priest looked grave, and he knelt beside the little dwarf and put his hand upon his heart. And after a few moments he shrugged his shoulders and rose up and said, "Your funny little dwarf will never dance again. It is a pity, for he is so ugly that he might have made the king smile." "But why will he not dance again?" asked the Infanta, laughing. "Because his heart is broken," answered the chamberlain. And the Infanta frowned, and her dainty rose-leaf lips curled up in pretty disdain as she cried, "For the future, let those who come to play with me have no hearts." And she ran out into the garden. The end.